The survey brief called it a flooded access corridor. 11 years of instruments, 3 separate dive teams, and 1 very expensive remotely operated crawler had all come back with the same reading. A pale composite orb, 2 meters across, suspended at chest height in the middle of a submerged alien hull, 40 meters below the surface of Carath-Venn's inland sea. Inert, impenetrable, Category 3, meaning we logged it, named it, and left it alone. They sent me because I was cheap and available, and because, as my supervisor Calla Morn put it, I had a talent for getting close to things that don't want company. She meant it as a compliment. I think. My name is Ren Kasul. I am 57 years old. I have been a commercial salvage diver for 31 of those years. Cold water work mostly, on survey worlds where the alien ruins tend to be submerged, and the pay tends to be poor. Before that, I worked harvest nets on the northern shelf back home, hauling line with my father in water so cold it made the air feel warm by comparison. I am not a scientist, I am not a soldier. I hold a Class 2 dive certification, a salvage recovery license, and a bad left knee that complains every time I descend below 20 meters. I descended to 40. The haul was larger than the survey file suggested. The ROV footage had given us a partial ceiling and a sense of scale, but in person, in the water, fins trailing, light cutting through green-gray column drift, it was something else entirely. The walls were pale basalt composite, the alien kind, smooth in the way that takes 10,000 years and not a single hand. The columns rose at intervals along both sides, narrow at the base and then flaring wide at the crown, like trees that had decided to become architecture. The floor was silt-covered and undisturbed. Nothing had moved on it in a very long time. The orb floated in the center. I had read the survey notes 3 times on the way out. Every instrument read it as passive. The ROV had bumped it twice with no response. The first dive team had pressed a gloved hand against its surface for 6 seconds. Nothing. The second team had run a low-frequency pulse along its equatorial line. Nothing. The third team's lead diver had pushed his mask against it and spoken through the regulator. Nothing. Plus a report note reading, attempted verbal contact, negative response, object surface, cool and smooth, no texture variation. I had marked that note with a small pencil check because it was the most honest thing in the file. He had just talked to it. Sometimes that's all there is left to try. I did not plan to talk to it. I planned to run a slow perimeter sweep, take my readings, note anything the ROV had missed from its angle, and ascend. Standard work. I had done it 200 times on worlds no one else remembered to visit. I came around the eastern column cluster, and the orb was there, directly ahead, and the current shifted. It was a slow surge, thermal differential, the kind you get in enclosed, submerged spaces when the water column above you moves. Not dangerous, just enough to push me sideways and down, and I reached out with my left hand to steady myself against the nearest fixed surface, which happened to be the orb. My palm pressed flat against it. It was warm. Not machine warm, not the residual heat you get from an active power source. It was warm the way a hand is warm, the way something alive holds warmth without meaning to. I felt it through the dive glove, a transfer, steady and even, and I held still, because in 31 years of working around things that were not designed for human hands, the first rule you learn is that when something surprises you, you do not move until you understand it. The current steadied. Around me, the column drift slowed and then stopped. The silt on the floor, which had been lifting faintly at the edges of my fins, settled. My hand did not want to pull away, and I was not sure if that was the orb or just the diver's reflex. When you are 40 meters down and something stable presents itself, you hold it. The warmth moved. It traveled from my palm, up through the wrist, along the inside of my forearm, and then it split, up through the shoulder and across the sternum, and separately down through the elbow and into the bones of my hand. It was not painful. It was not electric. It was the closest I can come to describing it. Bone recognition. The way a cold body remembers what warm feels like and adjusts, not with shock, but with the quiet competence of returning to a known state. A tone came with it. Not in the water. In me. In the jaw. In the cavity behind the sternum. In the exact resonant architecture of a human chest. It was below hearing and above feeling. A calibration, if calibration were something that could be done to a person without their consent and with what felt, impossibly, like care. I did not panic. I want to be honest about that. I am not especially brave, and I have been frightened underwater before, genuinely frightened, the kind where the training takes over because the person inside the suit has already left for somewhere quieter. This was not that. This was something else, something older than panic. The orb's surface changed under my palm. A seam appeared along its equatorial line, hairline thin, and from it came a light that was not quite pale gold and not quite amber, somewhere between the two, the color of a coastal dawn through mist. It did not illuminate the hall. It moved through my glove and into my skin, and traveled the same route the warmth had traveled, and I understood, in the way you understand things at 40 meters when the rational mind has agreed to wait outside, that it was reading me. Not my dive certification, not my salvage license, not anything Callum Morn had sent me down here to provide. It was reading the bones. My father mended nets for 30 years. His father before him worked tide pools, reading current direction from the pattern of silt displacement. A skill so old and so particular that there is no formal name for it in any salvage manual I have read. My grandmother, on my mother's side, had been what her island called a water reader, a person who stood at the shore and felt the current with her feet through the sand, and knew, without instruments, which channel was safe and which would pull. I had thought that was just what people said about old women who lived near water long enough, the kind of story that replaces the actual knowledge once the knowledge has nowhere to go. The tone resolved. It came through the jaw and the sternum simultaneously, and it was not a voice the way voices are voices. It was a transmission, a delivery, something the orb had been holding, sealed and ready, for a very long time, waiting for the specific architecture of the body that carried this particular history. Drifted true, first current. 5 words, clear as a compass reading. Addressed to me, not to the salvage diver with the bad knee and the Class 2 certification, but to the sum of every hand that had learned to move with water instead of against it, every body that had understood that current is not an obstacle but a direction, every generation of my line that had carried the builder's original lesson forward without knowing it was a lesson, without knowing anyone had seeded it, without knowing anything at all except that water teaches if you let it. The builder's seeding had not been a king's inheritance or a soldier's lineage. It had been simpler and, I think now, more necessary than either. They had found the human trait that mattered most to navigation, the capacity to yield to a current, read its intention, and move through it without fighting it to exhaustion. And they had cultivated that trait across the generations of my line, the way you cultivate a receiver frequency. Patient, specific, uncelebrated. The orb had not needed a hero. It had needed the person whose bones remembered that water wins. The seam closed. The amber gold light withdrew back into the equatorial line and faded. The orb returned to pale composite and suspended stillness, and the current in the hall resumed its slow column drift, and I was a 57-year-old salvage diver, holding a neutral buoyancy 40 meters below the surface of an inland sea on a world nobody had gotten around to naming yet. I checked my air. I took one slow breath. I did what my father's hands had taught me before I was old enough to understand why. I felt the current, found its direction, and moved with it toward the ascent line. Some things you fight, some things you read, and follow, and trust. They had known, whoever built that orb, that there would always be humans who knew the difference. I was just the one they had been waiting for to come back down,